The sun rose slow over the plains like it was reluctant to show its face, spilling pale gold across miles of dry grass and broken fences. Wind moved through the land with a lonely whistle, carrying dust, old regrets, and the smell of cattle that had known better days. This was the frontier, unforgiving and honest, where a man's reputation rode faster than his horse and mistakes never stayed buried. On the edge of this land stood the town of Hollow Creek, a place that smiled in daylight and sharpened its knives by night. Ethan Cole rode toward it alone. He had the posture of a man who had spent most of his life in a saddle, and the eyes of someone who had seen what silence could cost. His hat sat low, shadowing a face weathered by sun and loss, and his coat bore the marks of long roads and hard seasons. The horse beneath him moved steady and calm, as if it trusted Ethan more than the world ahead. Folks on the outskirts noticed him at once, pausing their work, watching the way one watches a storm that might change direction or hit straight on. Hollow Creek did not welcome surprises. As Ethan crossed the town line, the sound of hammering slowed, conversations thinned, and doors creaked half shut. He had not been back in years, not since he sold his share of land and chose the quieter life of a ranch miles away from trouble. But trouble had a way of growing roots, and something had pulled him back. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was unfinished business. Or maybe it was the sight he caught near the abandoned homestead on the ridge, the place everyone avoided like it carried a curse. A woman stood there. She was still, almost too still, dressed plain and worn thin by travel or hardship, her posture guarded as if the land itself might turn on her. The wind tugged at her hair, revealing a face marked by bruises that time had not yet softened. She did not wave or call out. She only watched Ethan ride past, her eyes sharp with caution rather than fear. That look stayed with him long after he passed, settling somewhere deep where old memories slept. By the time Ethan dismounted in front of the general store, the town had already decided how it felt about his return. The sheriff came out slow, belt heavy with authority and compromise. He did not smile, he did not offer a hand. He only nodded once, the way men do when they want distance without open hostility. Behind him, the store owner pretended to rearrange shelves that did not need rearranging. A pair of ranch hands crossed the street rather than pass too close. Hollow Creek remembered Ethan Cole, and memory here was not kind. "You should not be back," the sheriff said, low enough that only the wind might overhear. "I did not come for trouble." Ethan replied, his voice even trouble does not need an invitation in this town. The sheriff answered, glancing toward the ridge where the abandoned homestead stood like a scar against the sky. Word spread fast. By sundown, everyone knew Ethan was back and everyone guessed why, though no one dared say it outright. The preacher avoided him at supper. The saloon grew quieter when he stepped inside. Old friends suddenly found reasons to leave town or turn away. Ethan felt the weight of it all pressing down, heavier than the saddle ever had. Later that night, as lanterns flickered and shadows stretched long, the warnings began. A neighbor stopped him near the livery, voice trembling between concern and fear. "Let it be," he said. "Whatever you are thinking, let it be. That place ruins men." Another warned him near the well, eyes darting as if the dark itself might hear. "Some stories do not want to be uncovered. People disappear when they try." Even the preacher found him outside the church, hands clasped tight. "Mercy is not always welcome here," he said. "Sometimes it costs more than it saves." Ethan listened. He always did. But listening did not mean obeying. That night, sleep refused him. The wind rattled his windows like a restless spirit, and the image of the woman on the ridge returned again and again. He remembered another time, years ago, when he had watched injustice pass by because it was safer to look away. Someone else had paid for that silence. The memory burned hotter than the whiskey in his glass. At first light, Ethan saddled his horse and rode toward the abandoned homestead. The land changed as he climbed, the grass giving way to rock and dust. The house stood crooked but stubborn, its boards gray and scarred by time. A single fence leaned like it had given up the fight. Ethan dismounted slowly, announcing himself not with words but with patience. He did not want to startle her. He did not want to become another threat. The woman met him outside, a rifle held low but ready. "I'm not here to run you off," Ethan said. "That makes one of us," she replied. her voice steady despite everything. Her name was Clara. She did not offer her story freely, and Ethan did not press. He saw enough in the way she stood, the way she scanned the horizon, the way she kept her distance even as she spoke. She was surviving, not living, and Hollow Creek had already decided she did not belong. When Ethan returned to town later that day, he made his choice in full view of everyone. He spoke at the council meeting, standing alone while others whispered behind their hands. He said the woman had a right to stay. He said the rumors were lies born of fear. He said he would vouch for her with his name and his land. The room went still, then cold. Faces hardened. Lines were drawn without words. By nightfall, Hollow Creek turned its back on him. Supplies were refused. Contracts vanished. Men who once shook his hand now spat near his boots. Children were pulled indoors when he passed. The saloon doors closed before he reached them. Ethan felt the town shifting, tightening like a noose, and he knew there would be consequences. Still, when he rode back to his ranch and saw Clara waiting by the fence, relief cut through the dread. "You should not have done that," she said quietly. "I know," Ethan answered. The days that followed were heavy with tension. Cattle routes were blocked, fences were cut. At night, shapes moved beyond the tree line, watching, waiting. Ethan stayed alert, rifle close, trust closer. He taught Clara the land, the safe paths, the places to hide if things turned bad. Neither of them spoke of the storm building around them, but both felt it coming. Hollow Creek did not forgive defiance. One evening, as the sky burned red and the air smelled of rain, Ethan stood on his porch and looked back toward the town. Lights flickered like distant eyes. Somewhere, a decision was being made that would not be undone. He knew that by morning, things would change forever, and whatever came next would demand more than courage. It would demand everything, and in that quiet moment before the fall, Ethan Cole did not look away again. Morning came hard and bright, cutting through the plains like a blade that showed everything it touched. The land looked the same as it always had, wide and indifferent, but Hollow Creek felt different now, like a place holding its breath. Ethan Cole rose before the sun, boots hitting the floor with purpose, senses sharpened by the weight pressing on his chest. He had lived long enough to recognize the silence that comes before trouble, the kind that settles in when men make decisions in the dark. Outside, the ranch felt watched. Clara stood near the corral, already awake, already alert. She had slept little, if at all. The rifle rested against her shoulder, not out of fear but habit, and her eyes moved constantly, measuring distance, listening for sounds that did not belong. When she saw Ethan, she gave a slight nod, not gratitude but acknowledgement, the way two people do when they understand the road ahead will not be easy. They did not speak much that morning. Words felt fragile, and neither wanted to waste them. Ethan saddled his horse with steady hands, though his thoughts raced ahead to the town. He knew Hollow Creek would not let yesterday pass unanswered. Pride ran deep there, deeper than reason, and men who felt challenged often struck back where it hurt most: land, cattle, reputation. A man could lose all three before he realized the fight had started. When Ethan rode toward town, Clara watched him go, her jaw set tight. She had seen this before in other places, other towns that smiled until someone stepped out of line. She feared for him, but more than that, she feared the cost his kindness would demand. Hollow Creek greeted Ethan with cold precision. The general store door remained closed, though it was well past opening time. The blacksmith turned his back when Ethan approached. A pair of ranchers stood talking near the well and fell silent the moment he passed. No one challenged him openly. That would come later. For now, they let the message settle into his bones: you are alone. At the edge of town, Ethan found the sheriff waiting, posture rigid, eyes narrowed beneath his hat. You made things harder than they needed to be, the sheriff said. I spoke the truth. Ethan replied, truth does not keep the peace, the sheriff answered. Fear does. Ethan held his gaze. Peace built on fear rots from the inside, he said. The sheriff exhaled slowly, glancing around to make sure no one else was close enough to hear. You should leave, he said. Take her and go before this turns ugly. It already has, Ethan replied, then turned his horse and rode away by noon. The first strike came. Ethan's cattle, driven toward the eastern grazing route, were turned back by armed men claiming town authority. No paperwork, no explanation, just crossed rifles and cold eyes. Ethan argued until he realized argument was what they wanted, an excuse. He pulled back instead, choosing restraint where others would choose pride. That choice cost him. By evening, word spread that no one was to trade with Ethan Cole. No feed, no tools, no hands willing to work his land. Even men who owed him favors kept their distance. Hollow Creek was not shouting its anger yet, it was squeezing. When Ethan returned to the ranch, Clara saw the tension in his shoulders before he spoke. "They're closing in?" she said. "Yes," Ethan answered. "This is not your fight," she added. Ethan looked at her then, really looked, and saw the truth written in her scars and silence. It became his fight the moment he chose not to look away. Night fell heavy and restless. Coyotes cried in the distance, their voices rising and falling like a warning. Ethan took the first watch while Clara rested inside, though sleep came to neither easily. The fire burned low, shadows stretching long across the yard. Every creak of wood and rustle of grass pulled Ethan's attention sharp as a drawn blade. Sometime past midnight he saw movement near the far fence. 3 figures moved carefully, confident in their numbers. They did not speak, they did not rush. Men who moved like that had done this before. Ethan stepped into the open, rifle in hand but lowered, firelight catching his face. "You are trespassing," he said. One of them laughed softly. "You do not own this land anymore, not the way you think." They cut the fence and let the cattle scatter into the darkness, hooves pounding, chaos spilling into the night. Ethan fired a warning shot into the dirt, but they were already retreating, melting back into the land that protected them. By dawn, half his herd was gone. Clara stood beside him as they surveyed the damage, her face pale but controlled. This was only the beginning. She knew it. He knew it. Hollow Creek had chosen its weapon, and it was not done drawing blood. Ethan rode out that day to track the missing cattle, pushing himself hard, anger and resolve fueling his pursuit. The trail led not away from town but around it, circling like a message. They wanted him to know who held power. As the sun dipped low, storm clouds gathered fast and violent. Thunder rolled across the plains, shaking the earth, swallowing sound. Ethan pressed on, refusing to turn back, until rain came down hard enough to blind man and beast alike. That was when he heard the shot. It cracked through the storm, sharp and deliberate. Ethan wheeled his horse around just in time to see Clara's rifle fire from the ridge near the ranch. Another shot answered it from the tree line, then another. Fear surged through him like fire. He drove his horse hard, rain lashing his face, heart pounding louder than the thunder. By the time he reached the ranch, the storm had passed, but the damage remained. Smoke rose from the barn, flames licking at the beams, eating through years of work and memory. Clara was gone. The barn collapsed in on itself with a roar, sparks shooting into the darkening sky. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, rain steaming off the embers, rage and dread twisting together in his chest. He dropped to his knees beside the fire-blackened dirt and found a trail leading away, boot prints pressed deep and purposeful. They had taken her. By morning, the town gathered as if summoned by an unspoken call. Ethan rode in with ash on his coat and fury in his eyes. He did not shout, he did not threaten. He walked straight to the sheriff and laid Clara's dropped rifle at his feet. "You know who did this?" Ethan said. The sheriff did not answer. "You know where they took her?" Still silence. Ethan leaned closer, voice low and dangerous. "If you do nothing, you are choosing a side." The sheriff's eyes flickered, then hardened. "You brought this on yourself," he said. The crowd murmured, approval mixed with fear. They wanted this to end. They wanted the problem removed. And if that meant sacrificing 2 lives to protect their lives, so be it. Ethan turned away from them all, the weight of the town's judgment heavy but no longer binding. He had crossed the line long ago. There was no returning now. He rode out alone, following the trail into the hills, into land even Hollow Creek feared. His resolve was clear, his path set. He would bring Clara back, or he would burn every rotten truth this town had buried. The reckoning had begun. And Hollow Creek would soon learn what happens when a man stops fearing the crowd and starts fighting for what is right. The land beyond Hollow Creek rose into broken hills where the wind cut sharper and the ground remembered every footstep that crossed it. Ethan Cole rode hard into that country, leaving the town behind like a sickness he had finally named. The sky above him stretched wide and merciless, clouds dragging their shadows across the earth as if trying to keep pace. Every mile he put between himself and Hollow Creek stripped away something familiar, replacing it with focus, with purpose sharpened by fear for the woman taken from his land. Clara's absence weighed heavier than the rifle across his saddle. Ethan followed the trail with the patience of a man who had tracked cattle through dust storms and snow alike. The prints were deliberate, not hurried, made by men who believed no one would follow. That belief angered him more than the theft, more than the fire. It spoke of certainty, of power unchecked. Hollow Creek had given them that certainty. As the day wore on, the land grew harsher. Trees thinned, rocks jutted from the earth like old bones. The hills were known to swallow men whole, and stories said even the law did not ride here unless forced. Ethan pressed on anyway, guided by instinct and memory. He had passed through these hills once before, years ago, chasing something he never caught. This time he would not turn back empty. Near dusk, he found the first sign they were close. A scrap of cloth snagged on a thorn bush, torn from Clara's sleeve. He dismounted and held it in his hand, letting the rough fabric ground him. They had not been careful. Or maybe they wanted him to find it. Either way, it confirmed what he already knew. She was alive. And she was fighting. The trail led downward into a narrow pass where the wind died suddenly, leaving an uneasy stillness behind. Ethan slowed his horse, scanning the ridges above. Men who took hostages often believed themselves hunters, but they were just as often prey waiting to be caught. He moved carefully now, every sense stretched thin. That was when he heard voices. They drifted from a shallow ravine ahead, carried faintly on the cooling air. Laughter, low and confident. The sound of men who felt untouchable. Ethan tied his horse and moved on foot, using the rocks for cover, easing closer until he could see their camp. 4 men, 1 fire, 2 horses tethered nearby. And Clara. She sat with her hands bound, back straight despite the bruises darkening her face. Her eyes were sharp, defiant even now. She did not beg. She did not cry. Ethan felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest at the sight of her holding herself, together while surrounded by men who mistook cruelty for strength. The men spoke openly, careless in their certainty. "Hollow Creek will sleep better once this is done," one said. "And Cole will learn what happens when you stir old dirt," another replied. Ethan listened long enough to understand the shape of their plan. They did not intend to keep Clara alive much longer. She was proof of something buried, something that threatened men with names and influence. Easier to erase her than face what she knew. Ethan did not wait for night to deepen. The first shot dropped the man nearest the fire before he could stand. Chaos erupted instantly. Clara twisted away as another man reached for her, buying Ethan the second he needed. He moved like a force the hills themselves had summoned, precise and relentless. 2 more fell before they could mount a defense. The last man ran, panic breaking his confidence, but he did not make it far. When it was over, the fire crackled softly, unaware of the lives it had just witnessed end. Ethan crossed the distance to Clara in seconds, cutting her bonds with shaking hands. She looked up at him, relief flashing across her face before resolve settled back in place. "I knew you would come," she said. Ethan did not answer right away. He pulled her into a tight embrace, grounding himself in the reality of her warmth, her breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with feeling. "We are not safe yet." They did not linger. Ethan gathered what supplies he could, mounted one of the spare horses for Clara, and led them deeper into the hills. He knew the town would send more men once the first group failed to return. Hollow Creek would not accept failure quietly. They rode until the moon climbed high and the land opened into a hidden valley shielded by stone. It was a place Ethan remembered, a narrow pocket of safety where the wind rarely reached and water ran clean. He made camp there, keeping the fire small, hidden from view. Only then did Clara finally let her guard slip. "They know," she said softly, staring into the flames. "They know what I saw." Ethan nodded. He had guessed as much. The truth always demanded witnesses, and witnesses were dangerous. "Years ago," Clara continued, her voice steady but distant, "I passed through Hollow Creek with my husband. We saw something we were not meant to see, men burying bodies outside town. Not criminals. Women and workers who asked too many questions." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. The missing names, the quiet disappearances, the rumors brushed aside, it all fit together now. "They took my husband that night," Clara said. "Told me if I spoke I would join him." Ethan felt the weight of his choice settle deeper. This was bigger than one woman, bigger than one town. Hollow Creek had built itself on silence and blood. At dawn they made a plan. They could not outrun the town forever. Sooner or later, Hollow Creek would hunt them down. Ethan knew the only way forward was through the truth itself. Evidence, witnesses, something even the town could not ignore. They rode back toward the outskirts, careful to stay unseen, stopping at a ranch owned by a man Ethan trusted from years past. Thomas Reed was old, stubborn, and had long since stopped caring what Hollow Creek thought of him. When Thomas saw them arrive, battered and desperate, he did not ask questions. He let them in, locked his doors, and listened. "I always knew this town was rotten," Thomas said when Clara finished. "I just did not know how deep." Thomas had papers. Deeds, old transaction records, names that connected powerful families to the land where the bodies were buried, enough to make men nervous. Enough to change the balance, but news traveled faster than they expected. By the next evening, Hollow Creek was at Thomas's gate. Men gathered with rifles and torches, faces twisted by fear more than anger now. The sheriff stood at the front, torn between duty and survival. He called out to Ethan, voice carrying across the yard. "Come out, and this can end." Ethan stepped into view, Clara beside him, Thomas at their backs. For the first time, the town saw her clearly. Not a rumor, not a shadow, a living witness. "This ends when the truth is spoken," Ethan said. The crowd shifted uneasily. Whispers rippled through them. They were no longer certain of themselves. That was when a shot rang out from the back. Thomas fell. Chaos erupted. Screams, horses reared. The crowd fractured as men scrambled for cover. Ethan dragged Clara behind the porch as bullets tore through wood and earth. The night exploded into violence, the reckoning everyone had tried to avoid finally tearing its way into the open. When the shooting stopped, the yard was littered with wounded pride and broken lies. Thomas lay dying, breath shallow, eyes fixed on Ethan. "Do not let this die with me," he whispered. Ethan promised him with everything he had left. By morning, the town was split wide open. Some fled, some hid, some stood stunned by what they had helped create. Word would spread now, beyond Hollow Creek, carried by men who could no longer pretend they had seen nothing. Ethan and Clara stood at the edge of the property as the sun rose, the future uncertain but no longer hidden. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. And Hollow Creek would never be the same again. Dawn crept over Hollow Creek like a witness that could no longer be kept away. The light revealed what darkness had allowed men to ignore. Broken fences, scorched earth. Blood soaked into soil that had already swallowed too many secrets. The town looked smaller in the morning, stripped of its confidence, its lies exposed by the simple honesty of daylight. Smoke drifted low from the night's violence, and the air carried the heavy stillness of a place that knew it had crossed a point of no return. Ethan Cole stood near the fallen porch where Thomas Reed had drawn his last breath. The old man's body had been covered respectfully, though respect came too late to matter now. Clara stood beside Ethan, her face set, eyes clear in a way they had not been before. Fear still lived in her, but it no longer ruled her. What replaced it was resolve, sharpened by loss and the truth that had survived despite every attempt to bury it. The sheriff emerged from the crowd slowly, his authority hanging loose around him like a coat that no longer fit. His face was pale, lined deeper than it had been the day before. He looked at Ethan not as an enemy now, but as a mirror. "This has gone too far," the sheriff said, voice low and strained. "It went too far a long time ago," Ethan replied. Around them, townsfolk gathered in uneasy clusters. Some looked ashamed, some angry, some frightened by the sudden collapse of certainty. They had lived their lives believing silence kept them safe, that ignoring cruelty was the same as preventing it. Now that belief lay broken at their feet. Clara stepped forward. She did not shout, she did not accuse. She simply spoke. "I am not the first," she said. "I will not be the last if this stays hidden." Her voice carried across the yard, steady and unyielding. She told them what she had seen years ago, the graves dug under moonlight, the men whose names were erased because they threatened power. She named them. She named the land. She named the families who benefited from fear. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Some in the crowd looked toward the hills as if expecting the dead to rise. Others stared at the ground, recognizing names they had defended, men they had trusted. A few turned away, unable to hear more, but many stayed, and that was new. The men who had ruled Hollow Creek from the shadows did not wait long to show themselves. They arrived armed, well-dressed despite the dust, faces tight with rage and desperation. These were not cowhands or shopkeepers. These were men who believed the town belonged to them by right. They pushed through the crowd, rifles raised, demanding silence. "This ends now," one of them shouted. Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between Clara and the barrels of their guns. "No," he said calmly. "It ends when the truth is finished." The standoff stretched thin, the air crackling with tension. Fingers hovered near triggers. One wrong move would turn the yard into a graveyard. The sheriff stood frozen, torn between orders and conscience. Then something unexpected happened. A woman from the crowd stepped forward, then another. A ranch hand lowered his rifle, a shopkeeper removed his hat. Voices rose, not in anger, but in agreement. Stories poured out, fragments at first, then whole truths. Sons who never came home. Wages never paid, threats whispered behind closed doors. The lie was unraveling. The powerful men looked around and realized the town was no longer behind them. Fear flickered across their faces, replaced by the understanding that control built on silence collapses when people find their voices. One of them fired anyway. The shot tore through the air, striking the dirt near Ethan's feet. Chaos surged, but it did not explode. Instead, the sheriff moved. He drew his weapon and leveled it at the shooter. "Enough," he said, voice shaking but firm. The man froze. Others hesitated. The moment tipped. Rifles lowered, hands went up. The sheriff called for restraints, and for the first time in years, his authority was used not to protect the powerful, but to hold them accountable. By midday, riders were sent to neighboring towns, carrying word of what had been uncovered. Evidence was gathered. Graves were marked, names were written down instead of erased. Hollow Creek became a place of reckoning, its shame exposed to the wider world. Ethan and Clara stayed long enough to see the first wagons of officials arrive, faces grim as they took in the scope of what had been hidden. Questions were asked that could not be silenced. Answers followed whether men liked them or not. But justice, even when it comes, does not heal everything. As the town buzzed with activity, Ethan walked alone to the edge of Hollow Creek. He looked back once, taking in the buildings, the streets, the people who would have to live with what they had allowed. Clara joined him, her presence steady at his side. "You could stay," she said quietly. "Help rebuild." Ethan shook his head. Some places need to stand without leaning on the man who broke their silence. They packed what little remained of his life there. The ranch was gone, burned, and scattered. His name was known now, spoken with a mix of respect and discomfort. That was fine with him. He had not done this to be liked. Before they left, the sheriff approached one last time. "I should have listened sooner," he said. Ethan met his eyes. "Make sure you listen now." The road stretched out before them, wide and uncertain. They rode together, leaving Hollow Creek behind, not in triumph, but in truth. The land opened again, vast and indifferent as it always had been. Behind them, a town learned to live without its lies. Ahead of them, something unshaped waited, neither promise nor threat, just the honest weight of tomorrow. Ethan felt lighter than he had in years, not because the past was gone, but because it no longer owned him. Clara rode beside him, head high, eyes forward, no longer running from shadows. Whatever came next would be faced openly, without silence, without fear. And as the sun climbed higher, burning away the last traces of night, the West carried their story forward, written not in whispers but in truth. The road carried Ethan Cole and Clara away from Hollow Creek, but the weight of that town rode with them longer than the dust on their boots. The land stretched wide and quiet, a vast canvas of grass and sky that asked no questions and offered no forgiveness. For days they traveled without seeing another soul, letting the rhythm of hooves and wind settle the noise left behind by gunfire and confession. This was the West as it truly was, honest in its emptiness, demanding endurance and clarity in equal measure. Ethan rode with his shoulders finally lowered, though his eyes remained alert. He knew better than to believe that truth ended danger. Men who lost power rarely accepted it with grace. Somewhere behind them, Hollow Creek was still unraveling, still exposing names and graves that would shake more than one town. That kind of reckoning sent ripples, and ripples carried consequences. Clara felt it too. At night, as they shared a small fire and spoke little, she would wake suddenly, listening to the dark as if expecting it to answer back. Ethan never mocked her for it. He understood the way fear lingered even after victory, the way memory clung harder than chains. He had lived long enough to know that survival did not mean peace came easily. On the 5th day, they reached a settlement barely marked on any map, a place known simply as Red Bluff. It was not much more than a trading post. A stable and a handful of weather-beaten homes pressed against a low ridge, but it was honest. People there looked each other in the eye. They asked questions and waited for answers. When Ethan and Clara rode in, heads turned, not with suspicion but curiosity. A man running the post nodded once and offered water without asking for coin. A woman sweeping her porch paused long enough to smile. It was a small thing, but it felt like air after being underwater. They stayed the night. Word traveled fast in the West, faster than any writer when it carried truth worth repeating. By morning, people were whispering Ethan's name, some with respect, some with caution. Stories grew in the telling, but the heart of it stayed intact. A rancher who stood when others stayed quiet. A woman who refused to vanish. That afternoon, a stranger arrived. He rode alone, coat clean, posture stiff with authority that came from outside places like Red Bluff. He dismounted slowly, eyes sharp as he took in Ethan and Clara. When he spoke, his voice carried the tone of a man used to being obeyed. "Ethan Cole, he said, that is my name," Ethan replied. The man introduced himself as a federal marshal, sent west on rumors that refused to stay rumors. He asked questions. Ethan answered. Clara spoke too, her voice firm and practiced now. The marshal listened, writing nothing, committing everything to memory. "There will be more like Hollow Creek," he said finally. "Places built on silence? Then maybe it is time they learned silence does not last," Ethan replied. The marshal nodded once. Men like him rarely showed approval openly, but it was there. He offered protection if they wanted it. Escort east, new names, clean starts. Ethan declined. Running was never the cure for rot, he said. The marshal left the next morning. His departure stirring something in Red Bluff. People talked openly now about the towns they had passed through, the injustices they had seen and ignored. Something had shifted, subtle but real. Courage once seen had a way of spreading. Ethan and Clara stayed longer than they intended. They worked. Ethan helped repair fences and break horses. Clara assisted at the trading post, her quiet competence earning trust faster than words ever could. At night, they shared meals with people who laughed easily and slept without fear of footsteps outside their doors. It felt almost like a life. But the West was not finished with them. One evening, as the sky burned orange and red behind the ridge, riders appeared on the horizon. Not many, but enough. Their approach carried intent. Ethan saw it immediately and felt the old tension tighten his chest. They were not from Red Bluff. The riders stopped just outside the settlement, their leader stepping forward with a confidence that came from desperation. He called out Ethan's name, voice carrying across the open ground. "You think riding away makes you untouchable," he said. Ethan walked out to meet them, calm as stone. "You should turn around," Ethan said. The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Hollow Creek might be breaking, but men like us do not break so easy." The truth of it hung heavy. Power lost did not always surrender. Sometimes it hunted. The confrontation drew the people of Red Bluff from their homes. No one hid, no one ran. They stood together, rifles visible, not raised but ready. The riders saw it and hesitated. They had expected isolation, not unity. Clara stepped forward beside Ethan. "You lost," she said. "And you know it?" The leader's face twisted, anger fighting fear. He glanced at the gathered townsfolk and understood the odds had shifted. He spat into the dust, a gesture of defeat masked as defiance. "This is not over," he said. Ethan met his gaze without blinking. "It is for you." The riders turned back the way they came, their retreat watched until they disappeared into the fading light. No shots were fired, no blood spilled. Sometimes the West decided enough had been taken already. That night, Red Bluff celebrated quietly, not with music or drink, but with stories shared around fires. Stories of standing, stories of choosing better when worse was easier. Ethan listened more than he spoke. He felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not pride, but belonging. Days turned into weeks. Ethan and Clara built something together, not a ranch this time, but a place of passage. Travelers stopped at Red Bluff seeking news, safety, and sometimes courage. Ethan never claimed leadership, but people looked to him anyway. Clara became a voice others trusted, her past no longer a shadow but a source of strength. One morning, a child asked Ethan why he had not left when he had the chance. Ethan thought for a long moment before answering. Because the West only changes when someone stays, he said years later, Hollow Creek would be spoken of as a warning rather than a secret. Its name would surface in conversations about justice, about the cost of silence. Some of the men responsible would face judgment. Others would fade into history, remembered only in the lessons they left behind. Ethan Cole would never return there. He did not need to. His story lived on in the spaces between towns, in the way people chose to speak instead of look away. Clara's story lived on too, carried by those she helped, by those who saw her stand and found their own strength reflected back. The West remembered them not as heroes carved in stone, but as people who refused to be quiet when quiet was demanded. And that was enough.